15-minute or less lecture series, Human Anatomy, Chapter 20, Somatic Senses and Motor Control. So, a sensation is a conscious or subconscious awareness of change. So you may not be aware of the change, but your body is. It involves a stimulus, the thing that is a change in the environment, external or internal, a sensory receptor that will lead to the production of a nerve impulse that is detecting the change and leading to production of a nerve impulse, the sensory neuron, which will take that information and conduct that nerve impulse to the central nervous system, and then, of course, the central nervous system that needs to receive and integrate that information to decide what to do about it. Sometimes the sensory receptor and the sensory neuron are the same structure. So, classifications of sensations. There are the general senses. These include the somatic senses, the tactile or touch, thermal sensations, temperature change, pain, proprioceptive associated with the muscles, skeletal muscles. We have various general visceral sensations, pressure, touch, stretch, chemicals, nausea, etc. And our special senses is another category, includes smell, hearing, touch, vision, and equilibrium. So we have somatic receptors that will then detect the change and send that information to the sensory neurons, which then sends information to the central nervous system. These sensory receptors can be divided by the structure. So, for instance, there are many sensory neurons that are also the sensory receptors. These could be free nerve endings that are just out there, part of the tissues, or they could be encapsulated nerve endings that are surrounded by layers of connective tissue forming a specialized structure. And of course, the free nerve endings are the dendrites of the neurons. And in other cases, you can have a separate cell, a non-neural cell, be the receptor. Receptors can also be broken down by the type of stimulus detected. Photoreceptors for light, mechanoreceptors that detect the actual physical change to the receptor structure, thermoreceptors that detect change in temperature, osmoreceptors that detect change in pressure, chemoreceptors that bind to specific chemicals, and nociceptors which cause pain and can detect a lot of different things. Finally, you can divide sensory receptors by their location of the stimulus. They can be exteroreceptors detecting stimulus outside of the body, interoreceptors that detect internal stimulus to organs, bloodstream, the composition of blood, and proprioceptors, which are kind of like interoreceptors but specific for skeletal muscles and joints. All right, the sensations, the tactile sensations. This is the sense of touch. There's crude touch, which is a vague knowing that something has touched you in that general area. These can include the type 2 cutaneous mechanoreceptors. These are slowly adapting receptors that will continue to send you a signal as long as the thing is touching you. These tend to be elongated, encapsulated receptors with the sensory neurons, dendrites within that encapsulated structure. And of course, usually associated with skin. Then there's the hair root plexus. They wrap around the hair follicles and detect when a hair has been moved, say by the breeze or an insect landing on you. And these are rapidly adapting. They tell you something happened and then they're done. Then we have fine touch. Fine touch can give you much more detailed information about what you are touching. These include the type 1 cutaneous mechanoreceptors. They're slowly adapting. They are basically saucer-shaped flattened discs with free nerve endings wrapped by connective tissue, and they are associated with the epidermis. Then we have the corpuscles of touch. These are also encapsulated nerve endings. So it's basically an egg-shaped sort of capsule of connective tissue around the nerve endings, and these are found within the dermal papillae of the border between the epidermis and dermis, and these are rapidly adapting. We also have the ability to detect pressure, aka how hard something is pushing on you, whether it's light or very, very firmly. This can be detected by the laminated corpuscles. These are ovoid structures in the dermis and border sometimes into the subcutaneous layer. They again have nerve endings within them, and they're widely distributed around the body. Also, corpuscles of touch and type 1 cutaneous mechanoreceptors can detect pressure, can tell the difference between a light touch and a very strong hard touch. We also have the sensation of vibration, a rapid repeating sensory signal. These can be also detected by corpuscles of touch and the laminated corpuscles. There's also itch and tickle. Itch is free nerve endings that are stimulated by the release of certain chemicals, so they're chemoreceptors. Tickle is also thought to arise from free nerve endings that are mechanoreceptors and distributed to certain areas of the body. However, it turns out that we cannot usually tickle ourselves because the cerebellum knows what's going on and prevents the self-tickling. Thermoreceptors detect change in temperature. These are also free nerve endings found in lots of places in the body. There are cold receptors. They detect changes from 50 to 105 degrees Fahrenheit, and warm receptors that go from 90 to 118 degrees Fahrenheit. Extreme temperatures, either really hot or really cold, will instead stimulate nociceptors, pain receptors. Nociceptors, pain receptors, are also free nerve endings. They are found in every tissue in the body except the brain. So they are stimulated by a variety of things, including chemicals that are released when tissue is injured. They are also stimulated by a sufficiently intense sensation. So, for instance, when it's really late at night and you are walking around and you flip the lights on and it sort of hurts the intensity of the light, that is the nociceptors being stimulated. There are two types of pain: fast pain, which is acute, very localized, happens really quickly, and then stops. And then there's slow pain. Slow pain can last for seconds, minutes, even longer, maybe years. Sometimes it's a mild pain. Sometimes it can be extremely excruciating. And it can be localized to an area where there's an issue, or it can be distant from the site. And also, it can be very difficult sometimes to determine what is causing the slow pain. Referred pain. Referred pain is when the pain sensation associated with an organ, with a visceral structure, ends up spreading out to an area more distant from that organ. The most famous of the referred pain is, of course, the pain associated with a heart attack. So the heart, as we know, is in the mediastinum, the middle of the chest. Often when someone is having a heart attack, they feel that pain in the left side of the thoracic cavity. However, also sometimes some people experience a sharp shooting pain in the left arm, and this is the referred pain in an area not really associated with the heart. And as you can see here on this picture, there are a lot of areas associated with different structures that you wouldn't expect. Proprioceptive sensations. These are sensations that help us know where our head and limbs are located, how they are moving. They're associated with muscles and tendons, the stretch of these muscles and these tendons. And it turns out that people who lack proprioceptive sensational input have trouble doing things that we take for granted. For instance, since they don't really know where their legs are, they have to look at their legs and feet when walking. The main receptor associated with muscles is the muscle spindle. This structure is where you have a few muscle cells localized and encapsulated by a sheet of connective tissue that also is including special nerve endings that are wrapping around these muscle fibers. These are the intrafusal muscle fibers within the muscle spindle. And they will then send sensory information to the sensory nervous system when these fibers are stretched. There are also gamma motor neurons. These motor neurons go specifically to the intrafusal muscle fibers to make sure those fibers are always taut to allow us to detect when the muscle is being stretched, even if the muscle overall isn't in a stretched state. And then there's the alpha motor neurons, which are outside the spindle, and they innervate all the extrafusal muscle fibers, aka all the rest of the muscle. And of course, an example of a muscle fiber being stretched leading to a response is the doctor hitting the patellar ligament of the knee, leading to a kicking. So the overall function is to measure the overall length or stretch of the muscle organ to make sure it does not get overstretched. This also helps to perceive where the limb's position is, how it's moving, helps us to coordinate the various contractions of our various muscles, and again, prevents the muscle from being overstretched, helps to avoid injury. Tendon organs. Tendon organs are specialized structures associated with, surprise, surprise, tendons. They're composed of connective tissue wrapping around some innervated collagen fibers, so nerve endings associated with collagen fibers that could be stretched. Their function is to basically try to protect the tendon and the muscle from becoming overstretched and being damaged. So when they're stimulated, they want to signal the muscle to relax. There's also the joint kinesthetic receptors. This is basically a collection of various kinds of receptors around joints, trying to make sure the joints are used in a manner that prevents injury. So they can detect pressure, acceleration, deceleration, any excessive strain. very protective function, and they can include all kinds of things such as tendon organs, free nerve endings, lamellated corpuscles, and type 2 subcutaneous mechanoreceptors. So, somatosensory pathway. Somatic sensory receptors or neurons detect information. The somatic sensory neuron sends the information to the central nervous system. It will arrive in the primary somatosensory area of the brain, that very thin area on the brain. And then that is where we detect that sensory information. Also, some of the sensory information may be sent to the cerebellum. The first order sensory neurons are the ones going from the receptor to the brain stem or spinal cord. The second order neurons are the ones that carry that information to the thalamus or cerebellum. And then the third order neurons send the information from the thalamus to the primary somatosensory area of the cerebrum. Note, you don't have a third order neuron if you're sending information directly to the cerebellum. And again, as we know, the thalamus acts as a relay station of much sensory information, and that the right sensations are going to go to the left side of the body, the left to the right, because of that decussation event in the brainstem. So, the posterior column, the anterior and lateral spinal thalamic tracts, and the anterior and posterior spinal cerebral tracts are the ones that carry the information, this information to the brain. Right, from here we need an associative tract to send information to the primary motor area. The frontal lobe, this is where the command for muscle movement, skeletal muscle movement must occur from. Probably many neurons involved in this process, but for a direct route, you just need one neuron to communicate to that lobe. All right, so from the primary motor area, we have the direct motor pathway. You have an upper motor neuron that originates in the motor area of the cerebrum, and it goes down into the brain or spinal stem or spinal cord where it'll synapse with a lower motor neuron that goes to the skeletal muscle. So you need two motor neurons, three sensory neurons, two motor neurons. And they travel among the lateral cortical spinal tracts, the anterior cortical spinal tract, and the corticobulbar tract, two various regions of the body. Also, we have an indirect motor pathway, which is probably the most common. This is where the nerves end up having to form a more complex polysynaptic circuits within the brain. It's very complicated. It involves the thalamus, the cerebellum, the basal nuclei, and it has its own tracts within the spinal cord that the indirect pathways follow. The rubrospinal tract, the lateral medial reticulospinal tracts, the tectospinal tract, and the vestibulospinal tract. So it can get complicated. You can have basal nuclei, neurons from the basal nuclei, neurons from the cerebellum, neurons from commissure neurons, all affecting the upper motor neurons. You can also have various interneurons in between the upper motor neuron and the lower motor neuron, which can also receive information from various tracts. It can get very, very, very complicated to lead to that final muscle contraction. So again, basal nuclei is involved. It's involved in initiating and terminating movements so that they're coordinated. It suppresses unwanted movements, controls muscle tone, and can influence cortical function, cognitive functions in the brain. The cerebellum is important for monitoring the intention of movements, as well as monitoring the actual movements, comparing what you want to what's going on, and then sending corrective feedback to make sure you are doing what you want to do. Again, the direct tract would have the receptor that may be the first order sensory neuron that then synapses the second order sensory neuron, that synapses the third order sensory neuron that reaches the primary somatosensory area of the cerebral cortex, passes through an associative tract neuron to the primary motor area of the cerebral cortex, that then goes by an upper motor neuron down to a lower motor neuron down to the effector. That's as minimal as you can get. Disorders: amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, which is progressive muscle weakness and atrophy caused by destruction of the motor areas in upper and lower motor neurons, and Parkinson's disease, which is a degeneration of dopamine releasing neurons in the basal nuclei. It leads to a neurotransmitter imbalance, leads to a controlled shaking, muscle rigidity, slowness of movements, and a decrease in range of movements, as well as some cognitive defects. And that's it.